And so I think that is how I would think about repurposing. It's not just about repurposing the content, like taking this podcast and cutting it up. It's also about repurposing your ideas and being able to take those and cut them up and use them in different ways.
What you just heard was a piece of the goodness that came out of this episode. My guest this week, Justin Simon, he is the founder of Distribution First, where he helps content marketers escape the endless content creation cycle by focusing on strategic distribution. With over a decade in content marketing and SEO, he's helped teams maximize their content's impact without burning out. Justin's approach flips traditional marketing on its head and teaches marketers how to make their existing content work harder and drive better results. He's also the host of Distribution First podcast and creator of the Content Repurposing Roadmap. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to the Small Business Sweet Spot. I'm Barb Davids, and I'm here to help you get more website traffic and leads with simple, actionable SEO and content strategies. In each episode, I share tips and tactics and talk with other business owners who help us grow both in our business and in life. I'm so glad you're here. Let's go. Thank you for taking the time today, Justin, to meet with me about content distribution. Are you excited?
I am pumped. Anytime I can talk about content distribution, I am excited. So yes.
Excellent. All right. So I will fill in a little bit. We won't go into the whole background like I mentioned, but I do want to fill in a little bit. I met you through your podcast, Distribution First, and you have a community, Distribution First. And at the beginning of all this, I thought, oh my God, how much could you really do about distribution? Don't you just put it out there? And no, it is so much more than that. So I would love to at least just go into what it is at least, and then kind of blow people's minds about how it's not just putting stuff out there like we do once or something.
Yeah, for sure. I think the more that I've gotten into it, I mean, obviously, yeah, I kind of the same way, like how much can I talk about distribution? And it turns out a lot. I've been talking about distribution for 3 years at this point. And there's always a different angle because things are constantly changing. Ultimately, the way people are spending their time creating content, most marketing at this point is driven by content and then driven by advertisements. And for like a service-based company, especially if you're just getting started, you typically aren't spending any money on ads. And so most of your time is spent developing content. And the struggle that I always had was the idea of, if I'm spending all this time creating content, what happens after I hit publish? Like, I just spent all this time writing this blog. And I think historically a lot of folks think, well, Google will just rank it and then people will just find it and then, magic happens, right? Like blogs are just magically discovered on the internet. And anybody who's done SEO is like, that can happen, but it doesn't always happen. And actually, the more, like, I did SEO for 10 years, and what you actually realize is 80% of your results are coming from like 20% of your pieces of content. So if Google isn't going to rank that 10 to 20% of content, that doesn't mean it's not good. It just means it's our jobs to then get that back out there and make sure our audience can see it, hence distribution.
That is fantastic. Good point. Only some of it. And you believe in like redistribution. There's that whole sort of things. Talk about how that plays into the idea of distributing.
Yeah, I think the struggle for marketers and business owners, myself included, I have this struggle, is we think if we say something once, everybody has heard it and everybody is bored of it and nobody everybody's already got it and understands. And the redistribution, repurposing, remixing side is all about the idea of taking your IP, and I think for a small business that is critical, coming up with your IP, your ideas, and being able to distribute those ideas across the internet all the time. Because if you're doing your job right, there's a constant influx of people in and out of your system. There are folks who glob on to Distribution First, love it for a little while, and leave. There are, or like glob on and stay on, or are just untapped and have never heard about, just like, the internet is massive. There are so many, the way businesses work now, there are like billions of people that are out there that could potentially see your stuff. And so the idea being that if the more you can get comfortable with repeating yourself and repeating your messages, repeating your frameworks, repeating your systems, if you're a small business owner and you have a way of doing something that somebody else wants to hire you to do, it is incumbent on you to say that probably every single week in some way, shape, or form. This is what I do. This is how I do it. If you want it, come and get it. Like, and just getting comfortable saying, and obviously it doesn't always have to be that broad. Maybe sometimes you're talking about a high level funnel or a high level problem that you solve. Sometimes it might be very specific around your services, but it all ties back together.
And how does repurposing come into all this?
Yeah, I think repurposing comes in with the idea of, especially if you're doing it strategically, you don't have to create as much content as you might think. So let's say I have a distribution first framework. There's 4 phases in the framework. If I simply took those 4 phases, and I'm literally in the process of doing this now, break out each of those phases and then built out a plan to talk about those 4 phases in multiple ways with different angles and different things, and just did that, I would always be talking about the 4 phases of distribution first and being able to talk about that in new and unique ways. And this is something that I think authors do really, really well. If they have a book and they're outlining their book, and there's typically, we'll say nonfiction authors, just a nonfiction author would do this really well. They're going to have a book, they're going to have a premise, and then they're going to go on tour for the next year. Every podcast they're on, every article they write, every guest post they put on, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about what they're in and what they're doing. I mean, you look at somebody like James Clear, who, wrote Atomic Habits, one of the best sellers of probably the last decade. He's still talking about habits, believe it or not. And he has, from my knowledge, he hasn't written another book, and he just keeps on talking about it. And so I think that is how I would think about repurposing. It's not just about repurposing the content, like taking this podcast and cutting it up. It's also about repurposing your ideas and being able to take those and cut them up and use them in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a good point. I do want to go back to your 4 phases, your 4 parts for your marketing, your framework for distribution. Can you cover those?
Yeah, absolutely. There are 4 phases that go into distribution first. And the whole reason behind distribution first is to get the typical way folks think about distribution is they lob it on at the end. So I'm going to create the content and then I'm going to figure out what happens with it after.
Yeah.
Distribution is trying to get that as close to the front end of your content process as possible. So phase 1 is foundations. And so that is making sure you know your core messages, or that could be themes, that could be campaigns, topics, your core messages. Pick 3 to 5. So you're creating guardrails in the foundation phase of what you're going to talk about, creating POVs off of those messages. So what's your take on it? Because if you're competing against another service business or you're competing against somebody else, their topics are going to be the same, but their points of view probably aren't. And so your points of view can be what you've learned in the past, what you struggled with, what got you to this point, those type of things, and then understanding which channels you want to distribute your content on. Because again, most people, they think they have to be everywhere, or it's so overwhelming, with all of the options. Should I do LinkedIn and email and newsletters and Instagram and YouTube and TikTok and Threads, and you just on and on and on, Reddit, and right? Like, you've got all these ideas and all these things you can do. Get all those out of there in the beginning phase and pick 1 or 2 and really execute on that 1 and 2 and do that really well. So phase 1 is foundation. Step 2 is execution, and that's where you actually start to put those things in motion. So I would say audit your existing content if you have some, to align with those messages and points of view and channels, and then repurpose that, get that back out into the marketplace. So you don't have to create anything new. You literally could hit pause on creation, go back to your archives, knowing what your messages are and your points of view, and start resharing that stuff back out. Whether, again, based on what your channels are. Maybe it's Instagram and TikTok, or maybe it's LinkedIn and email. It really doesn't matter. It's whatever works for you and your business.
Okay.
Step 3 is optimization. So now we're going to fine tune everything. So were those messages the right messages? Did people resonate with them? Which ones? Okay, I got to double down on that. What else do I have in that space? what took off, what didn't, as far as a content type. Oh, I shot this particular video in this way. I'm going to try to do that again. Or I didn't do any video. I might try to do some video this time. And then step 4 is maximization. And it's really like where you actually start to truly implement distribution first. All your foundations are set. And now I'm going to maximize what I've been doing. I'm going to add more channels. I'm going to add more content types. I've got a system down. And now I have the freedom to be able to actually execute distribution first at a really high level.
That makes it seem easy. What do you think keeps people from like doing the practice of the distribution and thinking about like, what is the one thing you come across when people are like, hey, Justin, help me?
Oh my goodness. It kind of depends on where you're at. So how I think about the framework is so you can sort of plant yourself on a spot, right? And so you can understand like, do I have my messages? Do I have my POVs? I think one of the problems folks have in getting started is they try to jump steps. So it's like, I'm going to just start, I'm just going to keep creating, and I'm never going to hit pause to get this stuff figured out. And so I think that's maybe step 1 is just kind of like being willing to pause whatever you're doing. And again, it doesn't mean you have to necessarily maybe stop creating content altogether, but really just step back and think about why you're doing what you're doing. And then the alignment across. So stripping everything back to what is necessary. And again, it's kind of vulnerable to choose one or two. It's like to pick one or two messages and a point of view, and to pick one or two things, and to pick like, it's like, oh, what if it doesn't work? It's a little scary, but I think being able to do that can start to free you up, because otherwise it gets too difficult to do, to even like, for instance, it gets way too difficult if you skip steps 1 and 2 to optimize. What are you optimizing for? What are your goals? What are you measuring? What are you, like every channel that you randomly posted on twice? Like, how do you get any feel for what's working and what's not? So I think that's the struggle, is honestly like just doing the steps and working your way through. Again, it sounds easy, but it's all in like the habit building and the actual execution of the system.
Okay.
How I would say, Barb, is it's sort of like budgeting. Like budgeting is simple, like whether for your business or like it's simple. Budgeting is not hard. The act of budgeting, the idea of it is very simple. I have this much money, I will budget it out, and it will go to these categories. The actual execution of budgeting is where it gets difficult, when it's like, I'm just going to spend that. I'm going to do that. All right. Like, so I think that's where the rubber meets the road. It's like, it's not that the theory of distribution is difficult to understand. It is actually very simple. The execution of distributing your content does get difficult when it's not applied properly.
Do you have any guidelines for like, if I were to do a blog post and the idea is I'm going to distribute it on all my channels when it actually goes live, is there some sort of guideline or like formula or something? Like, how do I know when to re-put it out on my socials?
I would say if it takes off, like how I would think about it is, so I use a tool called Shield that's LinkedIn specific. So it could be different depending on your platform. Okay. And that's the tough part with distribution too, is a lot of channels it's not like you get one uniform view across a lot of these things. But I'll just use this as an example. I might go back and time frame it from 6 months ago. So it's been 6 months. What was most popular 6 months ago? And then or what was most popular a year ago that I shared out, and then maybe pull that. I mean, you could do a quarter, or you could, depending on what it is for that exact piece of content. But if it was like a very popular idea, again, I think like if we're talking about like the 4 phases, or you have your own system or what, like you should be sharing that all the time. Like, again, maybe not that exact post, but that idea, that concept should be shared, pretty frequently.
Okay. And then you have a community. I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's fantastic. Can you share what brought you into creating that and what you provide in there?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's evolving. So we launched it in April. It's a community built around distribution, repurposing, really what happens after people hit publish on their content. And it's a great mix of both entrepreneur, sort of maybe agency owner type, service-based business, and in-house marketers. And so there's a great combination of ideas and information and things that come off and around it. And really how it's going to evolve is it's sort of this way now. You get like my current course that's built into it, but it's really going to be training built around distribution and then community off the back of that. So really to help people do what we just talked about, Barb. And that was one thing that I realized as I built out the community is, all right, I need to give people a path here, and we need to be able to work them through the system. So at any given point when somebody comes in, they can mark where they're at, they can get their, ducks in a row and say, all right, cool, I have done my messages, I have done my POVs, I'm ready to move on to step 2. What's in step 2, Justin? How can we now execute on this? And so that's where that's going to evolve to, is really to a spot where there's training and then community off the back end, to where people can work together and do that.
Well, yeah, I love it. I think it's nice just being able to springboard off of other people and that are not necessarily in my industry and see what they're up to too. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And let's talk about what you're doing in your business, maybe a fun project that you're working on, or are you testing anything fun? Like, how do you use this in your business?
That's a good question. So my business, it's ever evolving. I would say where it's heading is a mix of like high level coaching and consulting for companies. So if a company or a business wants to just get their distribution in order, we've got content, we know we're not doing enough with it, help me build out the system, or just build out the system for me so I can execute on it. That's one side.
Okay.
And that's probably the highest value of what I'm offering at this point. And then working with only a handful of folks at any given time on that. And then the community is the other part. It's much lower commitment, significantly lower from a dollar perspective for somebody coming in if they want to get that advice and be able to get that stuff. And then there's probably somewhere in the middle that could live something as far as like a more dedicated group coaching environment, where you don't want to pay the full-on fee of going one-on-one, but you also want to do it now. Like, I don't know if it'd be a cohort or something, but like that idea of like, hey, let's get 5 people in a group and let's go through it together, and then you guys can execute on that stuff together, and it could be more feasible there. So yeah, that's probably really trying to figure out how to use the community and membership around the core of the business is kind of probably the most exciting part of where I'm at.
Okay. That's awesome. I think because I just think it's such a neat idea, because for a long time, I never considered the distribution or the redistribution, or thinking about like, where should my content start? And I think you have a great perspective. Maybe you can go into that about maybe how to consider or how to decide your core source of content and how that might funnel through your process.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really spun from me joining a startup and becoming the only content marketer. So I used to work in a team, and when you work on any sort of team, there's buffer in what you're doing, right? It's not all on you, and then all of a sudden it's all on you, whether you're running your own business or working in a small team. You instantly feel like, oh, I have way less people, way less budget, and still all the same level of content that needs to get created and put out there. How do we make this happen? And so that's where that really started for me, was, all right, if I am going to do one thing, what's the one thing I can do that gets the most amount of impact for what we want to do? And every business is different, and there are seasons to what you may want to do at any given point too. So let's say you really need clients now. You're going to do content differently, and your core might be different than if you are set with clients and you need to start planting seeds for 6 months from now and start getting people aware of the problems that you help solve. So for instance, if you need to make sales, you need to be like creating content that is sales oriented content, speaks to your program, speak to what you offer, speaks to your, how you're selling, and then using the right channels to be able to do that stuff. That's where email lists are really, popular, because they're sort of opting in at that point to receive that type of content. That's where communities could be beneficial if you have a group of folks who have already purchased something from you, and you can then reoffer something different. So that could be a core type of content. Or, just generically, a podcast could be a great core piece of content that you create, and you maybe create 1 or 2 a month, and you figure out what those topics are and those messages based on what you just talked about in phase 1, and you say, all right, awesome. I need to speak to these problems, and they tie back to my business. I need to speak to these problems. I'm going to have somebody come on, or I'm going to have an episode where I talk about it. And then I'm going to cut those things up, those ideas and those core messages, and we're going to share those out on the channels that we also chose in phase 1.
You make it seem really simple. So that's good, right? That's excellent. What have we not touched on that you think is important for people to know about distribution?
I think so. We were laughing there about like it being simple. It is simple. Like, I truly want people to understand it. It does not. You do not have to overcomplicate this stuff. It's pick one message, pick one POV, and pick one channel, and you're off to the races. And if you can do that and be consistent, your consistency is actually what's going to give you more leverage in the long run than your content. So the more consistent you can be with what you're doing, because most people are going to give up. Most people are not going to be consistent. 99% of people will not do this or take the effort to do this.
Okay.
But if you send out an email every single week at the same time with really good, valuable content that people start to like and look forward to, you're so much better off than trying to do 6 different things. And so, or if you're not able to record a weekly podcast, but you could record a monthly podcast, that really you don't even care about the podcast downloads. You just want the content to come out of it.
Mm-hmm.
You just want the social clips, or you just want the videos, or you just want, you want that sort of thing. If you can just start small and be consistent, that's going to give you so much more leverage than trying to do everything at once. So that would be the biggest thing. Like, it is simple. You don't have to overcomplicate it. Don't try to be everywhere. Don't try to do it all. Most people, I think one of the hard things with where marketing and the internet and all that is at is you might see somebody and they appear to be doing it all. They're everywhere. They're doing all this stuff. They've got all this stuff going. We have no clue the amount of money or people behind that operation to make that thing run.
Right.
We see the YouTube influencer, for lack of a better word, and we think, oh man, like they're just doing all that. No, they're paying people to do every single thing in that system, and they show up and film. Maybe they started out that way, but that's not their system today. Is not that. And so I think when I think about distribution, it's really what I would call like a content floor. So what's your minimum viable that you can consistently produce on any given channel? So if you're going to write blogs, what's the minimum viable that you can do at the optimal level, the best that you can do consistently? If you're going to do LinkedIn, what's the best that you can do every single week for right now? You can always get better.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to start a new channel, and so like a great example is when I started the community. There's no right or wrong way to do community at all. You can put new posts out every day. You can put new videos out every day. You can have workshops every week. You can have, a book club there's no right or wrong reason. But for me, the content floor was, all right, I'm going to do a Q&A where everybody gets together every single month and hangs out and brings their questions and gets those answered. And I'm going to do a workshop that's tactical and practical, whether it's me or somebody else that comes in, and we're going to do it every month. And that's the content floor. There might be more. Some months I do more, some months, but I never do less. That's the content floor. We always have that going in, and I'm always in the community talking. And I think whatever channel you end up choosing, keep it simple. The best way to keep it simple is to understand where's my content floor and what is the minimum viable that if life explodes, if things go crazy, if a project goes haywire over here, I can still execute on that.
Mm. That's a great piece of advice. So usually I ask people, what is their one takeaway that they would hope that somebody would walk away from this episode? Is that the takeaway, or do you have something else you would hope that if they could only take one thing away, what would it be?
If there's one thing I would take away from building a distribution system or trying to add distribution into your content marketing, it's that it's a non-negotiable. And so you have to do it. If you're creating content, you have to distribute that content. And so it's just a matter of you finding the best formats and way to do it for you. And so I think that would be my biggest takeaway is what works for somebody else works for them, or maybe it's not even working for them. You just might think it is. And so what's going to work for you? So I'll give your audience a really practical, tactical example. So for me, my content floor is I do a weekly podcast episode. I do a weekly newsletter. So podcast episode comes out on Tuesdays. Newsletter goes out on Saturdays. So I spread these things out so I have margin. And then I try to do LinkedIn 5 days a week. And I would say for the last 2 years, I have hit that as a content floor 98% of the time. There's only been, I think, 2 newsletters that I've missed. And I don't think I've ever missed a podcast. And sure, sometimes I skip out on LinkedIn. But for the most part, it's 5 days a week. And so I have one social channel, LinkedIn. I don't do X. I don't do Instagram. I don't do YouTube. I don't do any of that. Mm-hmm. I would love to be on all those, but I can't do it. I do LinkedIn, and then I do one sort of what I would call like owned channel. I do email, and so I can own that channel. So if LinkedIn dies tomorrow, if the algorithm shifts, I can still communicate with people. Mm-hmm. And then I have the podcast, and the podcast feeds a lot of what I'm doing. That's when we talk about that core message, that's a lot of it. So I think about like, what topics do I want to cover? What are questions people have? And then I record a podcast episode about that, and that typically will influence what newsletters I write. And then those things get cut up and put out on LinkedIn. And so that's how all that stuff gets put together. 3 things. It's not a lot.
Fantastic. Oh, this was so good. I'm really glad that you came on today. So thank you for that. If somebody wants to find out more about Distribution First or just reach out to you in general, what's the best way they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the best place to probably just kind of look and see what's all available is justinsimon.co. That's where everything kind of lives, and you can kind of see like, all right, where are the courses? What's this one-on-one offering? Okay, what about this community thing? If you are interested in the community itself, it's distributionfirst.club and CLUB, and you can go there and check it all out. Barb is in the club. It's great. Mm-hmm. And if you're interested in just learning, if you're like, I'm not ready to buy a thing, I'm just interested in learning how this works, search Distribution First on any podcast platform. You will find 85 plus episodes around distribution where we have experts come on. I do a bunch of solo episodes and we just jam on distribution.
It still amazes me that there's so much to talk about it. But it's a great podcast. I do recommend it highly. There's a lot of good stuff in there. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate Justin. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Barbara. It's great.
All right. And that wraps up this episode. Stay tuned for more episodes to help your business thrive online. We'll see you in the next sweet spot. Cheers. Thank you for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you're looking for SEO and content marketing help, you can find all kinds of information at compassdigitalstrategies.com. And if you like the episode, please tell a friend. Cheers.